We're so excited to welcome Josh Freeman, a labor historian who has written about the labor movement, worker struggles in New York City and elsewhere for many decades. I won't go through all the amazing books he has written, but I will say that Josh is a former delegate from Queens College. And so we are really happy to welcome him to talk about the Taylor Law, the challenges and opportunities it poses to us as public sector workers.
Thanks, Sophia, and it's great to be here and to see a lot of familiar faces in the room and on the Zoom, and it's all gotten nicer and fancier since I retired, so I don't know what that means. I think everyone knows that the PSC is in the middle of a difficult contract campaign. Difficult negotiations. It's been going slowly. A contract expired, a year ago already. And I think in such circumstances, it's really important to think about all the possible strategies, all the possible tactics that the union might employ to win a decent contract. The strike is the most powerful weapon a union has. But a strike under any circumstances is a serious and risky matter. And it's doubly so when it's in clear violation of the law. And any strike that the PSC undertook would be in clear violation of the law because of the New York State Taylor Law. So what I was asked to do is to give a little context that perhaps can help us think about, how we want to proceed, what are the challenges, the possibilities, the experiences under the Taylor Law. I'm going to keep it pretty short so that we get questions.
Yo.
Discussion. So let me begin with the origin of the Taylor Law. As many of you know, in 1935, Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act, and that was and still is the basic labor law of the United States. It gives workers all across the United States the right to join a union and engage in collective activity, including strikes. That's a legal protected activity under the law, except if you're not covered by it. And the National Labor Relations Act excludes certain categories of workers, including federal, state, and local public employees. So we are not covered by the National Labor Relations Act. And in 1935, when the law was passed, and for many years afterwards, in most of the country, there were no laws, one way or another, dealing with public sector workers, their right to join a union, strikes, any of that. So there was a kind of legal limbo in which public sector workers existed. Nonetheless, in New York and Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and a few other parts of the country, public sector workers began to organize and even very occasionally engage in strikes. And that was true in New York State as well as elsewhere. At the end of World War II, there was a big wave of worker militancy, and there were a couple public employee strikes in New York, including a Buffalo teachers strike. And in response to that, the New York State legislature passed a law called the Condon-Wadlin Act, named after two members of the legislature, that outlawed public employee strikes. Okay, and what the law said was, if you were a public employee and you went on strike, you were automatically fired. And to prevent people from being cute and just rehiring people, it also said—
Hey, Moss, are you okay? You haven't blinked in like 5 minutes.
If you were rehired, you could not receive a pay increase for 3 years. So you couldn't benefit from any illegal strike. In spite of the law, there still were some public employee strikes in New York. Sometimes the law was enforced, sometimes it wasn't, and things came to a head in 1966. And the occasion was the New York City Transit strike. For 12 days, the bus and subway workers went on strike, and it sort of shut down the entire city. And as part of the deal to end the strike, there was an agreement that the strikers would get amnesty from the Condon-Wadlin Act. It's interesting what actually happened, and it's a kind of cautionary tale. the assumption was the state just wouldn't enforce the law. And that's what sort of started happening. And then someone sued the state and said, you can't do that. You know, it's a law in New York State, you have to enforce it. So they had to go to the New York State legislature and get a special bill passed to grant amnesty, carve out these workers from convict involvement. And then they had to get the governor to sign it. And supposedly, although none of this was ever public, the deal was the TWU agreed to stay neutral in the next gubernatorial election in return for amnesty. So they did eventually get amnesty, but clearly the whole system was broken. I mean, you couldn't fire the entire New York City transit workforce, even if you wanted to. I mean, who would run the subways? So the whole thing fell. And this was the occasion for the governor at the time, who was Nelson Rockefeller, to initiate creating an omnibus new Labor Relations Act in New York State for public employees. And he appointed a commission. These were like the kind of leading industrial relations expert. The head of the commission was a guy named George Taylor. And they came up with a bunch of recommendations for new law. And the law ever since has been called the Taylor Law. It has a name. It's called the Public Employees Fair Employment Act, but no one ever calls it. It's just the Taylor Law. And the Taylor Law, by the way, this is getting into the weeds. It's probably not relevant for us, but it was an effort by industrial relations experts to come up with the state-of-the-art law. So it took the 30 years of experience with the National Labor Relations Act and drew on that to come up with a somewhat revised but similar model for a public employee framework for unions. So what does the Taylor Law do? Well, the first thing it does is it's something we take for granted now. It gives public employees in New York State the right to organize and be represented by employee organizations of their choice, something that was not previously legally protected, though many workers had organized anyway. Like private workers under federal law, if you work for a public agency in the state of New York, you can petition for union representation election. They have the election, you get a majority of the votes, and the employer then is required to recognize your union and engage in collective bargaining. This may not sound like much, but lots of states in the United States don't have this. And some states go farther and actually make it illegal to engage in public sector collective bargaining, even if both parties want to do so. So, for example, if the faculty at the University of Virginia unionized and went to the administration said, good idea, let's negotiate a union contract. They could not do that, even though both parties wanted to do this. It's illegal. So New York legalizes a system of collective bargaining. Second of all, just like federal private sector labor law, the law defines a series of unfair labor practices and outlaws them. Refusing to bargain in good faith is an unlawful practice under the Taylor Law. So is retaliating against an employee for protected union activity. So if you're, standing in front of your place of employment handing out union brochure and, the local agency you work for fires you, you go to court and you get rehired because that's illegal to do that. Third, the Taylor Law establishes a set of procedures to resolve conflicts between employers and employees and to reach collective bargaining agreements. If one party goes to the Public Employee Relations, that's the equivalent of the National Labor Relations Board under this law. It's the regulatory state agency that enforces the Taylor Law. If you go to PERB, as it's called, and say, look, we think there's an impasse in collective bargaining, help us out, PERB can appoint a mediator to try to come to a solution. This actually happened with PSC in 2016. In that case, CUNY went to PERB and said, there's an impasse, and we want to have a mediator, and a mediator was appointed, and so they got involved. This is not binding arbitration, okay? It's just voluntary mediation, and if either party doesn't agree with the results, that's that. At that point, PERB can then appoint a fact finder And this becomes a very elaborate process. It's like a quasi-judicial thing, they'll have hearings, they'll have testimony, and they can come up with a recommendation. Again, in most cases, this is not binding. The exception is for police, fire, and transit. So that's not us, but for those three categories of workers, at this stage, PERB can then impose binding arbitration. And it happens. I mean, this is not an abstract, both with police and fire in New York City, for example. And I might say, even if there's not binding arbitration, if you ever got to the stage of a fact-finding recommendation, that sets a powerful political marker. So, you know, that, even though it may not be enforceable, it's not a trivial act for them to do. Fourth, and I know this is what everyone's most interested in, the Taylor law prohibits strikes and other job actions by public employees. So it continues the Condon-Wadman prohibition. In a sense, the very purpose of the law, the reason why we have the law, was to continue that prohibition in an enforceable way. Where Condon-Wadman meant nothing because you couldn't enforce it. You know, Taylor law was designed to be able to actually enforce the prohibition of striking and other kinds of concerted job actions. Public workers in New York State who go on strike can be fined 2 days pay for every day they go on strike. Or to put it differently, let's say you went on strike for 5 days, right? You would lose the 5 days pay that you didn't work, but then you would lose an additional 5 days pay as a penalty for going on strike. Furthermore, the union that you belong to can be penalized too. And the most common way that's done is to deny it the right to dues checkoff. So, you know, we have dues checkoff, our dues are automatically taken out of our paycheck. PERB can, in enforcing a violation of Taylor law, take that away. And then the union would have to go person to person to collect the dues. But it doesn't stop there, because if, let's say, there's a threat of a job action of some sort, you know, we're going to go on strike. Someone can go into court, the employer can go into state court and seek an injunction against you going on strike or having some other kind of job action, right? If they get the injunction and then you violate, you know, that injunction, proceed with what you said you were going to do, you're now in contempt of court. And you can face very stiff monetary penalties, and you can be thrown in jail. And in fact, there have been numerous instances where union leaders have been thrown in jail for violating injunctions based on the Taylor. Okay? So this is pretty serious. I want to make one other point, because this came up while we were negotiating our last contract. You know, you can't get cute with this thing, you know. It's not just a strike that's illegal under this. Any kind of concerted job action is. So, you know, there was a lot of talk, for example, last time, let's have a grade strike. We won't even hand in our grades. But if that's a concerted organized activity, it's a violation of Taylor law. In fact, in theory, let's say faculty members at a single CUNY campus said, you know, look, we need a decent contract. This is ridiculous. We're not giving you no grades until something is moving, right? The entire PSC could be held in violation of the Taylor law, and it could lose, for example, dues checkoff for the entire union. So, you know, it's sick outs, slowdowns, one-day strikes, they're all the same as a strike. And by the way, the people who refuse to hand in grades, in theory, they can be fined for every day that they didn't hand in their grades, right? So, you know, whether that would actually happen, who knows? This has never come up, but I think you have to be careful for saying, oh, we're just gonna have smart and so I'll work around. It's not designed to do that. Finally, I want to mention one other provision of the Taylor law, one that we're living with right now, which is sometimes called the Tri-Borough Amendment. This is getting deep into it, but this was put in response to a labor dispute involving the workers at the Tri-Borough Bridge and Tunnel Authority. And what this unusual provision, very few states or the federal government have this, says that when a contract expires, a labor contract expires, it stays in effect until a new one is agreed to replace, no matter how long that takes, okay? And that's quite different than what you see in the private sector. I mean, let's say you work for a manufacturing firm and your contract expires, right? At that point, that company could say, you know, we pay these people too much, let's cut wages by 10%. And this health plan is incredibly expensive, screw it. Like, we're just dropping it, we're not giving them health insurance anymore. You know, and by the way, that grievance system, done, right? There's nothing illegal about that. As public employees in New York State, that cannot be done to us, right? As long as, you know, it takes, we are covered. So that's what's happening right now. We're getting, I'm retired, everyone else is getting their previous pay rate, and you still have your health insurance and so forth. This has advantages, it also has some perverse effects, because it reduces the pressure to settle contracts in a timely manner, right? You know, and usually in the private sector, it's like the contract expires, you know, September 30th, and there's a big push to get everything done, and if it's not done, we're on strikes. You don't see that in the public sector here. And you combine that with the prohibition on strikes, which is what will put pressure on the employer to settle. And there's no pressure on either side to settle. So routinely in New York State, public employee contracts expire and nothing happens for months and then for years sometimes at a time, right? You just keep under the old contract. In my entire time as a member of the PSC, there was never a contract that was settled in a timely fashion, right? They're always settled months and often years after the old one expired. And we're no different than anybody else in this regard. Now, I should say that, like, if we sign a contract tomorrow, it would be retroactive for the entire past year. So you get these kind of bizarre situations where you're getting the first year pay raise as one lump sum. It has very odd effects, but I think it helps explain this long period that you often have, which in my view is demobilizing. You know, of course, there's no end in sight, the thing just goes on, you love to hear the whole thing, but that's the law, that's the law. So what's been the experience under the Taylor Law since 1967 when it went into effect? The first thing, again, I think it's something we don't normally think about, is that literally hundreds of thousands of workers joined unions because of the Taylor Law. This was mostly not in New York City. Because in New York City, the big unions like the UFT, TWU, ASCME were already organized. But upstate and for state workers, suddenly there's a legal right and a framework to join unions. And this was one of the biggest expansions of the American labor movement since the 1930s, right, at that point. Which again, it's one reason why the state legislature would never just repeal the Taylor Law, nor should it. Because if it did, there'd be hundreds of thousands of workers whose employer the next day would say, you know, and you don't have to have union, you know, and you don't have any right to union. So that's effect number one. We just don't think of it in New York City. It's not really part of our labor history, but it's important to remember. Second, what about the experience with strikes? Okay, there have been many public employee strikes since the Taylor Law was passed, including some very big ones. There was the prolonged teacher strike in 1968. There was a shorter teacher strike in 1975. There was a citywide sanitation strike in 1967. There was a hospital workers strike in 1976. And there were transit strikes in 1980 and 2005. In all of these cases, the Taylor Law penalties were applied. Okay. Since 1980, however, there have been very few big public employee strikes in New York State. Okay, and in the last couple of decades, they essentially disappeared, with the one big exception being the 2005 transit strike. Now, was this the result of the Taylor Law? That's hard to say, because strikes in general, I mean, the last 18 months are a little, you know, can throw you off. The big pattern of strikes have disappeared from American life in general. Maybe there's a little revival now. So strikes declined in the private sector, which had nothing to do with the Taylor Law. So who knows whether it was connected. But the fact of the matter is there's very little experience with big public employee strikes in New York State since 1980. 1980. So let me talk about the two most recent big strikes. They're not so recent, the 1980 and 2005 transit strikes. And they're interesting for us, I think, because although transit and higher ed seem very different industries, they're actually structured in some ways similar. Both the MTA and CUNY are these kind of weird hybrid public entities, which are partially creatures of New York State and partially creatures of New York City, and have, in theory, independent governing boards. You have board of trustees, the MTA has a board. So structurally, we're actually very similar. The 1980 transit strike came at the tail end of the fiscal crisis, when transit workers, like other public employees, experienced deteriorating working conditions, stagnating pay. Several dissident groups challenged the incumbent union leadership, and they won a bare majority on the union executive board. They did not win the top office, but they had a majority on the executive board. The union officers negotiated a contract with the transit authority, with the MTA, brought it to the executive board, and the executive board rejected. And that set off an 11-day strike, which shut down the city. The strike ended with a new contract that was a substantial improvement over the initial contract offer that had been rejected. But the strike ended in complete disarray. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. There was a one-vote majority for the dissidents on the executive board. One of the dissidents was in the National Guard, and he went off for his National Guard training that weekend. So he wasn't in the room. There was a tie vote. No one knew how to resolve a tie vote. So the president of the union just said, strike's over, go back to work. And that was the end of the strike. In my view, so let me say, the strikers lost 2 days pay for every day they struck. And this was not trivial. Like if you're not scheduled, you don't get fined. But let's say you were scheduled for work 9 of those 11 days, right? You lost 18 days pay for a working class New Yorker. That is huge, right? The union lost dues check-off for 4 months and was fined $1 million. Okay. As a result of those penalties, many workers thought the strike was fair. The entire first year of pay increase went to pay off the Taylor law fines. Okay. Now, I actually think they're wrong that the strike was a victory if you had a career that continued for a number of years. So what the settlement did is it raised the base pay of workers 3% more than if they agreed to the original contract. And every increase for the rest of your career was building on that 3%. So, once you're talking about 4, 5, 6 years out, just on a strictly monetary point of view, in my view, it was a successful strike. But the fact that the Taylor law fines, the fact you got no change in your quality of life for a whole year, and the crazy way the strike ended, meant that it was a very disillusioning experience, and the workers didn't go on strike for another 25 years. The next strike in 2005 was a shorter strike. It was a 4-day strike. A lot of you may remember it. It was, again, the result of dissidents, in this case, the left-wing group taking over the union. Roger Toussaint was part of that group, was the president of the union at the time. This was essentially a defensive strike. The MTA was pushing very hard for big givebacks. They did not like this left-wing radical union. They were really trying to undercut it. They pushed for big givebacks, and the union responded with a strike. These were givebacks in pensions, in work rules, more than in pay rates. The strike ended with a tentative agreement that did have some givebacks for the union, but eliminated, I think, the worst of the givebacks, and generally, I think, was considered in and of itself a victory on most issues for the union. But then again, the story gets complicated, and again, it gets weird, like you can't make this up. So 22,000 people voted in the ratification for the contract, and the contract was turned down by the members by 7 votes. So that, once again, there's a complete disarray. In the meantime, the state immediately begins collecting the Taylor law fines. So people don't have a new contract, they're not getting any higher wages, and they're paying fines, in this case, for a more modest penalty, but 4 days pay. Meanwhile, the union was fined $2.5 million. It lost Deuce Chekhov for 2 years, and Roger Toussaint was sentenced to jail for 10 days. He was let out early on good behavior. Most current TW leaders, I think if you ask them, the people who run the union today, would say that the strike was failed. Again, I think they're wrong, but that's a long discussion. I think that it was an important marker to say that this union can't be pushed backwards, but many transit workers would not agree with me about that. So I just want to be clear about it. And then one footnote here, which I think many of you may be aware of, it's an ominous development for us. The guy who was the mastermind of the managerial strategy in 2005, Gary DeLavison, was hired recently by CUNY to negotiate the contract on behalf of the university. This is a very unusual thing. CUNY does not normally hire outside counsel. There are a bunch of reasons why they probably decided to do this that don't have to do with his personality per se, but the fact they chose him of all the people you could have chosen is a real marker, in my view. You gotta be really stupid to think that this is just some neutral choice, So very provocative thing in the university. He's a very, very, very skillful, experienced guy who's not a friend of unions. So we have these weird links to TWU. Okay, so let me, I've gone on for a long time. Let me just talk a bit. I talked about the challenges and the difficulties. Let me end by talking on the other side, how striking can pay off. And I think this is a pretty aware crowd, so I don't think I have to tell you a lot of this. But in the past year, we've seen multiple examples of the efficacy of strikes in both the private and the public sector. The efficacy of even just threatening to strike, has proved to be extremely effective. Just to give the highlights, cases, of course, there's the United Automobile Workers, which struck against the Big Three and won a tremendous contract, really big improvement. The screenwriters, who had this really prolonged strike and looked like they were screwed, they won. It took a long time, but they won. The Teamsters were on the verge of striking. They really had a credible strike threat. And at the last minute, UPS caved and gave them a very good contract. In higher ed, too, there's some very effective strikes last year, including huge historic walkouts at Rutgers University and at Cal State. The Rutgers strike involved 9,000 university employees. I believe there were 3 different unions that acted in an alliance, like CUNY, in multi-campuses. Cal State was only a 1-day strike, but it involved 29,000 strikers. And I believe, someone here probably knows better than me, I believe this was the biggest higher ed strike in US history. And both of these strikes won big gains for the members of the unions that took these job actions. Now, I should say in California, public employees have the right to strike, including university professors, and grad students, and so forth. Jersey's a little unclear. There's no statutory ban on public employee strikes. There have been some court cases that say it's illegal. It was interesting, in that strike, the governor of New Jersey, Phil Murphy, seemed to have no interest in busting the union or going after the union. And he actually pressured the university. I think he told them to come to the governor's, office or state house, wherever it is, and that's actually where they had the negotiations to settle the strike. So in a legally unclear situation, the fact that the governor was not taking on the right to strike proved very, very pivotal. We're in a different situation. Our colleagues did not face the same challenges we did. It's still worth noting that, at least in New York City, and I don't know enough about upstate, at least in New York City, as far as I know, since the Taylor Law passed, the unions that have struck have all survived. Okay? Some of them won a lot of things. I mentioned some examples. Some of them won nothing at all. The teachers on strike in 1975, they got nothing, right? They often suffered, serious short-term setbacks, but they all survived. None of them were destroyed by this. The 2005 transit strike was interesting in looking at the balances of, benefits and costs. That strike led to exceptionally heavy penalties, 2.5 million on the union itself and then on individual workers. The union survived in part because they anticipated this. So the TW owned a headquarters building on the west side, far west side of Manhattan. It sold it before the contract expired, so it would have a fighting fund. It still had a very difficult time for 2 years when they had to do this check off. I've been told that they lost about 30% of their revenue during those 2 years. And that's and what they got, they had to literally go, person to person and collect it, where they got banks to set up credit card collections. It was a mess. And with weird political implications also, because if you're not paid up, you can't vote in union elections. So that skewed a lot of things. So it was a very, very difficult situation, but they did survive. I think the union survived because at least while they were striking, they were very united. In both those transit strikes, everyone, with very few exceptions, went out to work. And in fact, in the earlier strikes too, of public employees, very, very high levels of participation. The only exception really is the 1968 teacher strike, which was like an entity unto itself, and it was about lots of things like community control, and that was a weird case. But in all these other cases, you have very, very high levels of solidarity among workers. The other thing that seems to me is necessary to successfully strike under these difficult circumstances is a high level of public support. In 2005, the TWU was very effective in convincing the public of the justice of its cause. And it, again, prepared for this to build ties with community organizations and links. And there was actually polling data done during the strike. Who do you think was right? Who do you think was wrong? And the majority of New Yorkers supported the union, not management, even though they were obviously inconvenienced enormously by not being able to take the bus to the subway. So I think, public employee strikes are inherently political strikes, and they have to be approached that way. That has a lot of challenges, but it also has a lot of opportunities. Teachers, sanitation workers, transit workers, because of the very nature of their job, create a public crisis as soon as they stop. That I don't think is true in the same way for college faculty and staff. On the other hand, it's not like we have no impact. Obviously we impact our students and their families, and their communities, and that's together a lot of people. So, we do have a footprint, but it's not the same as sanitation or transit or fire or police. And I think we have to be cognizant of that and thinking about that. And I think we have to be realistic, about how that might play out in time. So I'm going to stop. To sum up, strikes are risky endeavors. They're usually only undertaken as last resorts. Still, even in the face of legal prohibitions, they're not impossible to win, in my view. But no one should underestimate the risks, the degree of preparation needed, and the solidarity required for such actions to succeed. Thank you.
All right, let's see if this will work.
How is this? No echo, right? Well, thanks so much, Josh. We're going to open it up to Q&A, and we understand that some people may want to ask questions anonymously. We're going to keep recording, so if you want to ask a question, but you don't want to ask it yourself, just put it in the chat, and we'll have our chapter chair, Zoe, read it out for you without your name. And we'll take a question from the in-person audience and then from the Zoom audience. And I do want to know that we have over 100 people in this event, which is really cool. But also means to please ask your question quickly so we get some more. Let's go to in-person audience. Any questions?
Thanks so much, Josh. That was really excellent and informative. Just a question about the mechanism of the Taylor law with the question of in injunctions. Does PERB have to bring down the injunction in order for the Taylor law to be applied? Can you be prosecuted under the Taylor law if you're doing preparatory action for a strike before an injunction is passed to stop doing that? Or is that not?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, violating the Taylor law, I'm not a lawyer, so I may be screwing this up. In and of itself, it's not like a criminal activity, but you could be fined and penalized and so forth. But if someone gets an injunction, that is a kind of criminal activity, it's contempt in court. So if you stand up 2 weeks before the law, a contract expires and says, look, our contract is expiring and we should strike, that someone can get an injunction against you. At least this has happened in New York State. Again, mostly with the transit workers, that says it's illegal, enjoining you to stop saying it, right? Stop agitating, organizing, promoting a violation of the Taylor law. And if you violate that injunction, no strikes happened yet. Yeah, you've committed a crime. And it's interesting because this happened under Giuliani and it never really went up to the Court of Appeals, but there was a kind of civil liberties outcry because there's suppression of free speech. But yeah, it's interesting. Why did it take 2 years to get the dues checkoff back in after the 2005 strike? PERB said, or maybe it was the court, I'm not sure who, someone said that that Toussaint and the other officers of the union had to swear that they would never again go on strike or promote a strike. And Roger refused to do it for 2 years. And they just stood firm and they would not give them the dues checkoff back. And finally, the union leadership came. They just couldn't do it anymore. The cost to the union was too great. So yes, so it really raises free speech issues. The last time I remember these really came up, I think was in 2001 when the TWU, or 2002 when the TWU was threatening to strike, and they got an injunction against the threat to strike. But I'd have to go back and look at it. So the answer is yes. It's quite chilling.
So do we have one from?
Yes. Okay, so we actually have a couple questions on Zoom, and Scott and Eric, I see that you're in line, but I'm going to ask some of the questions that were put in the chat first. So someone wants to know, how is the length of time that dues checkoff is disabled determined? And I'll also add to that, how hard is it to arrange a different way to collect dues for a union? Those are kind of related questions.
Yeah, this is where I wish I was a lawyer and knew a little bit more of these. I believe it's PERB decides it. When we're not talking about an injunction, just a violation of Taylor Act, I believe it PERB decides. And it's pretty subjective. It was interesting. This again, I'm going a little bit off target, but we're in a college, we do scholarship. When they were writing this law, they thought one of the problems with the National Labor Relations Act is it separated the process of mediation and conciliation from union determination, union recognition. The federal government, you have the National Labor Relations Board and the mediation, reconciliation, and conciliation service. PERB has both those functions. And the idea is it gives them more latitude to shape the outcome. So, PERB basically wants not just how severe the action they're penalizing, but what they think the likelihood you're going to behave in the future, and so forth. So I think it's pretty subjective on that, when you forget the dues checkoff. Now, I think it used to be really, well, if you go way back, I'm a labor historian, in the old days, no one, you didn't take the money out of people's paychecks, you just collected the dues. The TWU, a union I knew a lot about, the way they collected their monthly dues is every month there's a different color union button, right? And you pay your dues and you got the union button. And you're supposed to wear your union button at work. And all your colleagues know whether you pay dues or not. So, it's like social pressure. So, unions have a long history of trying to figure out how to do this. But, at TWU, I think people can voluntarily, just like you could agree that you get automatic payment for your bills. You can get these credit card companies to set up automatic payment for your union dues. But TWU worked pretty hard, as I said, they lost about 30, well, I was told informally, so they lost 30% of their revenue. And so, it's kind of hard, and remember, we are no longer 100% union membership jurisdiction. I mean, I hate to say it, but PSC membership is starting with, I don't know, 10-15% not getting into this, so, it could be a challenge.
Can't hear him.
Okay, Lynn, did you still want to?
Yeah. Hi, Josh and everyone. So I have questions, and thank you. This was really great as always. I have questions related to, well, one, just to say that what you talked about in terms of like the why unions, given how like restrictive the law is, right? But like, why unions often have not, public sector unions have not opposed it because of the organizing rights and other obvious, and other reasons, and because it maintains the contract in place. Just to state, although I wish there was an effort to get rid of the parts having to do with strikes within it. But just to say that not everything would remain in contract that's in place of importance to our, within our contract. And as people know who went to the last bargaining, that the multi-year appointments, which is now in a pilot, where we've put forward the PSC proposals to expand and make permanent that, is something that could be, would be under threat, and it was pretty egregious what CUNY put forward. So we need to be stepping up that campaign, everybody, very quickly. I had a question regarding what kind of tactics, are there particular types of tactics that would be concerted action, but sort of are able to evade some of the Taylor law restrictions? A lot of the things I think about are more like occupations and stuff like that, that aren't work stoppages, but in your experience, right, like what are some of the tactics that people have used? And then secondly, sort of the question you talked about, what makes for successful strikes in this context, and given your PSC history, are there particular things that there was a strike authorization vote several years ago, right? Are there particular things that you would see as being critical for within the PSC and CUNY?
Well, let me start with the first one. It's interesting. We saw an example of this last week in New York City. I don't know how many of you followed this, but after a subway conductor was stabbed, the workers on that line worked to rule, right? So now how this plays out in our context may be different than in a transit system or a factory. But in many workplaces, if everyone actually followed the rules, the thing grinds to a halt. And that's what these workers did. They all the safety checks, all the little rules, and there was a huge slowdown of transportation on several of the lines in response. And that's very marginal. I think the MTA had no interest in going after them, for lots of sensible reasons. So, if it was a concerted activity, conceivably could have been a Taylor law violation. The same thing with sick out. If like everyone all on their own says, I'm just disgusted, I need a break, I'm not going to work, yeah, you might get away with it. But if you handed out pamphlets that said Tuesday, you've got the flu, don't come to work, that's a Taylor law. So I guess you can nibble around the edges, and I don't think there's been a lot of experience in higher ed and exactly what that would mean. Let me just say something about, to answer your second question. Obviously one of the things you need is solidarity. In places like Rutgers and UMass, who had a big campaign on a strike a number of years ago, one of the things I think these unions really stressed was to build solidarity between part-time and full-time senior and junior people. And that's not necessarily so easy. They're in very different life situations. They're often generationally different. And, in some systems, they're in different unions, entirely, So I think that's prerequisite to any action. And that's something you can't do overnight. And then the other thing is, other public service workers, I think we could build coalitions with the people we provide services to. And again, the PSC's done a lot of that over the years with students and other groups, but I think one advantage public sector workers have over private sector workers is the opportunity for those kinds of things to ally with the parents of children, the residents of public housing, the users of mass transit. And that's a big opportunity for us. So again, if we were ever really thinking about, gee, we really might have to do that. Again, we've done a lot of that already, but I think that's something I would look to do more of.
Thanks. Scott, you have your hand raised on Zoom. Do you want to go ahead? Can you yourself?
Thanks. Scott Ethier. I'm an adjunct at LaGuardia Community College. Thanks, Josh, for the talk. It was terrific. Just a question about the makeup of other public employee unions. And maybe this is something you have some statistics on. One of the things that makes PSC interesting is the fact that we have, ballpark of 50% of our bargaining unit as contingent workers who don't have, the job protections that we usually associate with union jobs for the most part. And I'm glossing over a lot, I know, but just sort of roughly, other than workers at SUNY, are there any other public employee unions that have a similar breakdown or a similar proportion of contingent to non-contingent workers?
I'm going to come up with an example. It's so silly, but it's real, but it's very small. The only one is the lifeguards, New York City lifeguards. And in fact, it's a huge political issue inside the union. There's a court case going on right now because there are some year-round lifeguards. They work in the indoor pools, and then the workforce expands greatly in the summer with the seasonal lifeguards. And the full-time lifeguards have said that the seasonal lifeguards are ineligible to run for union office. So they don't have a lot of solidarity there. Parks Department in general does have a fair number of seasonal workers, but those are relatively small groups. I mean, I think we are unusual for such a big group to have so many. DC 37 is a complicated organization. They have people who work, limited numbers of hours a week. School crossing guards is another group. They only work 9 months, 10 months a year, they work limited hours. So there are some other unions that have confronted it, but I think you're right to say we're unusual in the extent to which we're characterized by that.
Oh, thank you. I just have a quick question, related to that example you gave in the talk about if one campus decided to stop working or something. What's the tail I have to say about wildcat strikes that are not authorized by the union leadership? How does that work, or has that ever happened?
I think in theory, if the union, the workers who engage in walkout strike are subject to tail law penalties, okay? The union, if it explicitly renounces it, then in theory would not. And this came up in a very unpleasant way in 2005, when the international president of the TWU told the workers to go back to work because they were on an illegal strike, and he was trying to, I don't know what the heck he was trying to do, but one of the things he was trying to do, I think, was to protect the union, or certainly the international union, from any penalties as a result of their actions. I have to say that it was very nice that when he retired due to ill health, about a month later, justice was done. But so I think if a union said, sent out an email to every member of the union and said, "This is an illegal strike. We are against this. We discourage this. You should not do this," and workers struck anyway, I think the union would not be subject to penalties.
Can we go to Eric next on Zoom?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I was a striker in 2005 with the Transport Workers Union. There was, throughout the process leading up to the strike and then the strike and then for many months after the strike, there was a big and obvious clash between a new leadership in formation and a new leadership that had already sold out, in my opinion. I can honestly say that I helped organize the contract struggle and the strike itself. And I believe that the actions taken, particularly by Toussaint, were very detrimental to the victory of the strike. And let me just ask the following question, which is, how can we be sure, how can we be somewhat convinced that the workers in a strike, especially in a big strike that ties up the entire East Coast, like the transport workers strike of 2005, I believe that it could have been a big shot in the arm for worker struggles all over the country, and certainly all over the East Coast, that didn't happen because of, in my opinion, betrayal by the union leadership. We need a new leadership. We need to fight for that. I would say socialist leadership, but certainly just highly motivated workers who are not satisfied with the deal that they're trying to give them. And I finally on the road to getting something in that way. But for example, fine of the auto workers, don't give him a break. Push him. He's done okay so far in many ways, but we can't assume that he's going to keep up doing the right thing. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just briefly address it, because you raised some interesting questions. I mean, different unions have different procedures and bylaw requirements. How do you end a strike? You know, who gets to decide a strike's over? And, you know, in the case of TWU, as I mentioned, in 1980, it was this strange situation with tie vote, and basically the union president just gave himself the power to do that. And in 2005, Toussaint did go to the executive board of the union and say, you know, I have an agreement and it's good. He did not give a lot of details. And the executive board was divided, but they did vote to end the strike. It is very unusual to keep a strike going until it's ratified by the full membership of the union. But it's not unprecedented. There are a few unions that have done that, and that they do that. And it means you come to a contract and you stay out of work for a couple of days till you can organize a ratification vote. So, you know, those are different procedures and notions of what a democratic union is, you know, and, you know, this built into the structures of unions and their political climates too. And you know, it's a good question you raise. I mean, you know, the cliche that, you know, grizzled unionists like to say is anyone could take people out on strike. The trick is to bring them back in, you know, and in a sense, there's some, you know, what's good enough, you know, what's not good enough, and who decides that. So those are issues that every union has to confront.
Thank you. Hi, Josh. Thanks for this wonderful event. Really important. Three quick and I think interrelated questions. One is a strike fund. Could that be something set up that would an injunction would prevent if the union wanted to do that? Number two, if the strike fund would be set up, would the union be shrewd by saying, let's set it up in New Jersey, or let's set it up, base it in Canada?
Cayman Islands.
The law.
Or the Cayman Islands.
Okay, Cayman Islands, that sounds good. Or if not a strike fund, a solidarity fund.
Yeah.
And then the third thing is, three of the unions that have members at CUNY, the DC 37, Teamsters Local 237, and an SEIU union have all settled recently with they have a new contract. So will these city unions be able to act in solidarity and alliance with a strike of PSC members? And what would the law do to, for example, the DC 37 members who might not want to cross the picket line? And of course, that is a crucial, very, very important consideration when you think about strike strategy.
Yeah.
How that, because those workers, you want their support, you also want them to be protected. And, how might that dynamic play out? To the extent that you can answer this.
To be honest, I think I don't feel confident about answering any of your questions. I've never really thought about strike funds because they have not figured much in public employee strikes in New York City. Like the big, back in the day, like the 60s and 70s, when there were lots of strikes. There were never strike funds, but those strikes mostly lasted, 4 days, 5 days, 6 days. The 68 teacher strike was, of course, the big exception. The PSC already has a solidarity fund, so you have solidarity funds that speak to members in need for whatever reason, and of course, loss of income would be a reason. I don't know what the tailored treatment of strike funds is. I really just don't know. And I think on your second question about, well, that's true, in a lot of places, not just in the public sector, where you have the issue of, can an employer make an employee cross a picket line? And generally, it's if they're endangering themselves in some way, if there actually is a picket line, you have a better shot than if people just stay out in solidarity. If you just stay out in solidarity, it's a terrible violation, If there's a nice thick picket line in front of the entrance of the campus, I think workers, might be different. Look, a lot of this depends on the attitude of the employer, and what do they want to do? This is so hypothetical. We haven't ever had this situation, so it's hard to think it through. But it seems to me a lot would be dependent upon the spirit in which CUNY goes into this. They're gonna have to live with the aftermath. So, how stupid or smart are they about it? And then, to be honest, to me, one of the weird things is I have no idea who calls the shots. Zero idea. If we have a strike, I don't think the shots are called in New York City, but I have no idea. It's so opaque of how it works, that I don't know. So would the governor really want to, start throwing DC 37 people in jail for, not going to, we wouldn't think so, but it's very hard to know. We live in an atmosphere where there's never been anti-unionism in the public sector. Real serious, Scott Walker, Ron DeSantis type anti-unionism. We're utterly unprepared if we ever face that, but the assumption is we probably wouldn't face it, but who knows? The political climate can change.
Thanks, Josh. I am going to read some questions that were put in the Zoom chat because I think there's still some confusion over what exactly would result in a Taylor law violation. So one question is, if the law applies to collective work stoppages, but not all collective actions, what are the implications if we collectively refuse to do work for which we are explicitly unpaid? And then the follow-up question to that is, what is the boundary of a prohibited collective action? So for example, picketing CUNY Central is a collective action. Why isn't it prohibited?
Well, I think you need a big lawyer. I'm not one. I think some of it's what's written into the law itself. I think the phrase that's often used is concerted action, not collective action, concerted action. So, it's an interesting question. If, you have some activity that's a routine part of your job, but it's not specifying your job description. But you might be pushing it if it was a concerted activity. You handed out leaflets. You say, everybody, let's not do this thing. I think you'd be pushing it. Again, you have to take legal advice, and also, again, it depends upon the attitude of PERB and the employer.
Hi, people haven't been saying their names, or some people have. I'm Caitlin. I'm a grad student at Hunter, actually. So I know this is GC purview, but I think other campus representation is going to be really important going forward. At Hunter, there was actually a union rally last Thursday that a lot of students participated in, which was really exciting. And that's sort of the angle of my question and comments, because I really like that you said that we can't be cute about this whole situation. Because on the other end, the people who created this law were smart about it.
Yeah.
With a lot of, to set a lot of limitations. And I think going forward, it's going to be really important to get student solidarity and participation in this, especially CUNY being referred to and upheld as a working class university. Student support, I think, will be crucial because it's my understanding that students are not beholden to the Taylor Law.
Sure.
So that's mainly my question, because if students, not to put out all of our ideas out in the open right now, but if hypothetically students decided to all stand in front of an entrance and not move, or they themselves, do some sort of action to provoke a work stoppage or something, how could that affect the union? And what kind of repercussions could that put forward? Because I understand that, again, also with injunctions, it's like a very smart preparatory maneuver. And just lastly, there are many different people who work at CUNY, like was already mentioned. HEOs, which I saw was brought up in the chat, CLT advisors, getting them out into union actions will be really important, and really struggling for a class struggle leadership. Because I think, unfortunately, there's this view that, oh, it's the university, it's like this higher up sort of ivory tower situation. And I think if we bring it back down to the class question, which is really at hand here, that could really make or break whether or not we could do away with the Taylor laws.
So let me say just a couple things. Students not covered by the Taylor Law, only employees are covered. So a student can hold a bullhorn in front of the, main academic building at Hunter and say, the best thing that could ever happen to this campus would be the fact that we're on strike, it would make for a better workforce and a better college. They're not breaking the law. However, if 500 students block entrance to the building, they're not breaking the Taylor Law, but, the New York City Police Department might decide that, they want to intervene. There are other laws, but, they're not covered by the and we're not responsible for some of their students, right? So they are not restrained in this thing.
Thanks. Megan on Zoom, do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Megan. I teach at City Tech, and before that, I was a high school teacher and the member of the UFT. So I like to keep a running kind of list of the amount of years I've spent working under expired contracts versus current ones, and it far exceeds it. I've in 25 years, I've got, I think, 15 years or something under expired contracts, and far less under existing ones, which I think does speak to what you were talking a little bit about, the kind of the impact of the Taylor Law on negotiations. I hope this isn't too repetitive, but my question is similar to some of the things that other people have been asking about. I think trying to think about how do you test the limits of the Taylor Law. And as I worked under the UFT leadership would say everything was a possible violation, including like if you refused summer work, which is obviously not part of your contract because it was something you'd have to put in for, but if it was considered concerted, that was it. There's ideas, like I don't even know exactly what a work to rule campaign would necessarily look like at CUNY, but is something like that, how would, in your opinion, would that trigger the laws? I know the closest, as a member of the UFT, one of the things we did was what we called honor pickets instead. So we picketed outside of the school and everybody walked in at the same time, exactly at the time we were supposed to walk into, which is most teachers would go in earlier normally. And it was a great act of solidarity, but it doesn't challenge, work getting done. So I'm just wondering about that. The other question I have is related to what you were saying earlier about the enforcement of the previous legislation and law. If, one of the things I've heard say is like, if you want to really challenge the Taylor Law, the way to do it would be for a strike to stay out until part of the resolution of the strike is that, amnesty on the Taylor Law fines or whatever, or kind of try to do that. Is that even like, would that be something that you could demand or contract, like legally, would that be something that the employer could agree to? Or as you were saying before, in some cases, would that be legislature, or how would that even work if that was, if one were strong enough to make that kind of demand? I'm just curious what.
Yeah, I think that's very difficult. It's not up to the employer, it's up to get an amnesty, you have to have the state legislature pass a law, and you have to have the governor sign it. So, that's a big lift, to do that. In terms of your other question, I feel uncomfortable sort of parsing, this one's legal, this one's not, I'm not sure. But let me say something, I feel like I'm gonna sound like an old fart bureaucrat when I say this, because I'm all for rank and file initiative, but I think we have to be really careful here, because the union as an institution will suffer penalties. And I don't think it's appropriate that some small subgroup of people go off on their own and do something that might have really serious consequences for the entire union. We know the democratic decision-making process about,
Thank you.
engaging in that activity. So, I just think we have to think it all through, but we are one institution, one union, and I think we have to act that way.
Is there a question from the audience? Here in person? Okay, let's go to this.
Great. Anne, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi, and thank you, Josh. I'm chapter chair of the retirees. You probably addressed this, I might have missed it, but is not one of the penalties, if it's determined that we are on strike, that the Triborough agreement is moot, and that everything that's in the current contract is up for grabs once we would get back to the table? Is that true, or?
I don't believe that is, but again, I'm not a lawyer, I don't believe that is. I think it's fine. I gave a talk to Queens College, and someone said, if we went on strike, could they suspend our health insurance? And,
Not health insurance.
my initial reaction was no, this is covered by Triborough, but now I'm not so sure, because I don't know if you'd still be considered an employee while you're on strike. So I think there's a lot of untested ground here, but I don't believe that they could tear up the contract.
Any questions from in person? Great. Jack, let's go to you.
Thanks for doing this, Professor Freeman. It's great to see you again. I've got two questions. One's internal to the union and one is external. For those of us who feel as if a strike is the only thing that can really, or at least the threat of a strike is the only thing that can guarantee a solid contract with raises for all, what do you think is the best thing that we can do to prepare the union to be together in solidarity, the sort of actions that we can take to build towards a strike and make people ready and willing to fight? And then thinking about this, this crisis at CUNY is not in isolation, nor is the growth in working class self-activity or employee self-activity in the union. We're seeing strikes and unionization efforts taking place at campuses across the country. Campuses have been facing austerity for a year, adjunct as well as now reactionary attacks on the ability for kind of free speech in the classroom and to teach what you want. So how could those willing to organize for a strike kind of place this in a broader state and national context of a fight for higher education as a whole?
Well, I'm a labor historian. I'm not a labor leader or a tactician or strategist. That's too hard a job for me. I'm just like no more special insight than you have. I mean, I do think, look, we're part of the national union, and there's no reason why we can't try to build ties with other locals and also, faculty and other unions and address those things. So I think absolutely we should be thinking about that, and we should be talking about how other people have succeeded elsewhere. In terms of preparing for a strike, I mean, to me, the biggest thing is to get kind of everybody on the same page, to talk to all the different, the CLTs, the part-time faculty, so many different we're a weird union, we're like a quasi-industrial union in a faculty, in a university, you know, to understand each other's needs. I think the other thing, I was thinking about this, I'm not trying to criticize at all the way the union's conducted itself, but, you know, when people go on strike, it's usually because there's something really clear that they're fighting for, some existential issue that's gonna make their life fundamentally different before and after. I mean, usually moving forward, but sometimes defensively, stopping them from changing this, you know? And I don't know if we've done a good enough job articulating what that is in this country. I mean, I'm not sure I could tell you what I'd be asking you to strike about. You know, a good contract, but that's, yeah, that's a pretty, yeah, I mean, a good contract, yes, that's what it's about. But, you know, what are the critical 1, 2, 3 things that, you know, people, you know, if we ever got to the stage, you know, I'd be surprised if we did, but if we did, you're asking people to take real risks, you know, make real sacrifices. You know, and I think we have to know how to talk to the non-activist members of our union about what it is we're asking them to make that sacrifice.
Thanks. Josh, are you okay with a couple more questions?
Sure.
Great. Mark, how about we go to you?
Hi, Josh. Thanks for this. I just wanted to add something to your answer to Megan's question about amnesty. So in 1980, the leader of in the 1980 transit strike, the leader of the dissident faction was negotiating on the side with the state, even as the state was officially negotiating with the union president. And he was negotiating for a bonus that would have been paid on, you know, the first day or the first paycheck back, which would have effectively been equivalent to the cost of the Taylor Law fines. So it wouldn't have been technically amnesty, but it would have dealt, now it wouldn't have dealt with the actions against the union, but it would have addressed the question of the individual fines. As to the actions against the union, in both 1980 and 2005, there seemed to have been informal agreements between the union and the MTA as to the length that the Taylor Law, that the loss of dues checkoff would take, 3 or 4 months. And in fact, the MTA in 2005, the MTA went into court in support of the union's petition to get dues checkoff restored after 3 months. And it was actually the city, it was Mayor Bloomberg that went into court and opposed that joint petition and succeeded in doing so.
Yeah, Mark, half of what I know about these strikes I've learned from Mark, so thank you for clarifying this. This is a little bit why I went to that circuit of Condon Wadlin way back about an hour ago, you know, that you know, even if you cut a deal, you know, individual can intervene in ways that, you know, you don't control. And there's kind of a long history in New York of kind of gadfly right-wingers going to court, you know, and sometimes they win. So, you know, I didn't know about the thing about the bonus, and that's an interesting approach, but they're just very unpredictable situations once you get into them.
A question in the chat is interested to hear your opinion on unions that represent both city and privately employed members doing the same jobs, and how those unions can bargain collectively when some members can legally strike and others can't. So this is not CUNY, but unions like Doctors Council, SEIU, some are, yeah.
Well, it is CUNY, by the way. It is the PSC, you know, because our members who work for the RF are covered by National Labor Relations Act. And they have the right to strike, and they have struck, and not that long ago. But it's a relatively small component. I think it's unusual to have a strike of both private and public workers who are in the same union doing similar tasks. I don't think that comes up much. I mean, there are a number of very big unions like CWA and SEIU that have big private and public sector, you know, components to them, and that they have a a big advantage, but I don't think it's in this kind of, I mean, the big advantage they have there is that they can fund private sector organizing with public sector dues. And that's why they've been much more successful in most unions in organizing. But I really have not seen this particular example play out. I mean, it comes up, I guess, when you have subcontracted work. So you might have some public employees being janitors, but some of the work is also subcontracted out. But I really have not seen examples. I just don't know. So I'm just gonna have to pass it now.
And then another question is, how can we win our colleagues? Sorry, I don't know what is wrong with this mic. How can we win our colleagues to see it is more dangerous not to challenge the Taylor law than to strike?
Well, that's just a conversation, you know, I mean, it's a conversation, I think it's, you know, I mean, it's a conversation that I think requires stepping back a lot and talking about, you know, what's happened to our profession and our professions, you know, that were represented, you know, before my time, you know, CUNY was one of the best paid universities in the country, you know, and we've just slipped and slipped and slipped. And now why that's happening, a lot of reasons, you know, it's not only because of the Taylor law, but I think maybe a real discussion about, you know, higher ed in general, this goes to someone's earlier question about, you know, how we broaden out the discussion, you know, as well as our own particular circumstances, and then what could reverse that. And I think, you know, militant worker action is one piece of the story, but obviously there are other pieces too, including in the political arena with funding decisions, you know, the defunding of public universities, the devaluation of what, like the kinds of fields that I taught in, you know, most American, you know, most public leaders in the United States think they're total waste of time and money, you know, I mean, so there's a lot of things that are fed into, I think, you know, our changed circumstances. You know, that's a hard conversation to have. I mean, Queens College is a commuter college, maybe a little bit more than some of the others. You know, people finish their classes, they want to go home. You know, they've been there they've taught their 3 classes and they're ready to leave. And it's hard to find arenas and ways to do that. I think the union has been pretty creative, but I think that's the challenge, to find ways to. And a lot of it, I think, has to be small groups and one-on-one. You know, it's not an easy thing to do.
Thanks so much. And since it's almost 2:30, I think we'll end it there. But before we give Professor Freeman a round of applause, I do just want to make an announcement that is relevant to this discussion. So there is a group of rank and file members who are interested in organizing for strike readiness. We are not interested in small wildcat testing the limits of the Taylor law without a democratic agreement from the union. We want to bring the whole union in. We want a united, powerful, strong strike. And that cannot happen tomorrow. It cannot happen without slow organizing work that takes a lot of time, takes a lot of conversations. So if anyone is interested in helping with this, because we do need a lot of help, our union is massive and has a lot of different titles, and we also need to reach out to students. Please, you can come up to me and talk to me about it. There are also links being put in the chat for those on Zoom who want to get involved. But this discussion has just been so crucial for a better understanding of the Taylor law, for a better understanding of the real serious risks we're running up against. So thank you so much. Can we give Professor Freeman a round of applause? It's unbelievable.
Yeah. I need to go home today.
Can everyone, before you leave, can you also just make sure to sign in if you haven't already?